Hello everyone, welcome to Bards and Books. I am Usman and today we are doing a review on the Dragonlance Chronicles Trilogy. This is the very first of the Dragonlance books. Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Night, and Dragons of Spring Dawning. So a lot of dragons. Now these are D&D inspired books, Dungeons & Dragons, created in the early 80s. If you're not too familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, it's like a tabletop game filled with fantasy characters of all kinds. If you know fantasy, you probably know Dungeons & Dragons. These books are very YA in feel, I suppose. Very similar to the Forgotten Realms books, if you've read those. But anyways, let's just get into it. So we'll start with the first book, Dragons of Autumn Twilight. Now, this is very enjoyable. I gave this 3 stars. Now, the D&D vibes in this book are the strongest. You know, we're introduced to a cast of characters. There's a dwarf, a halfling, which is basically a hobbit, but they're called halflings. And our leader is, of course, a half-elf, because we all know you cannot run a D&D campaign without at least one half-elf. I'm pretty sure it's illegal. Not really. But yeah, definitely the strongest D&D vibes here. Even when the characters were in combat, let's say they missed a swing of the sword or tripped on a stone while in combat, you could totally tell, like, okay, they probably rolled a low number there, or their skill set in that field is just really low. So in that sense, very D&D. But honestly, if you go into this knowing it's like that, it's going to be super enjoyable. If you expect something more, you know, deeper or like just a more, I don't know, philosophical or whatever kind of fantasy, you're not going to get that here. This is just a fun adventure romp for when you need like a palate cleanser or something. So the weaknesses in this book, I mean, the first little while, it takes a while to get going because you're introduced to this huge cast of characters and there's a lot of POV hopping. So you're getting into these characters' head, you're seeing their dynamic without even knowing them very well. So it can be a little confusing, a little tough to get used to it. But once you are used to it, it's a breeze, it's very enjoyable. What was unusual and a very nice surprise for a book like this is that these are extremely rich characters and they have a long history with each other and they have a very interesting dynamic once you get a hold of it. And they're each harboring like dark secrets from each other, which made for a very, very interesting read and a very cool dynamic. And it's just not something you get in books like this. So it's very refreshing and a huge surprise. Made it incredibly enjoyable. How many times have I said it's enjoyable? So that's really nice, coupled with the fact that we're going through these kind of missions or dungeons, you can say, and kind of leveling up for this big climax. The end of the book does finish off with a big kind of climax and it really gets you excited for the next books. So yeah, this was super enjoyable. Like I said, I gave it 3 stars. Great for what it was. And now we get to book 2, Dragons of Winter Night. This was my favorite. If you're talking about middle book syndrome, it's the opposite here. Like, the middle book was the best. I gave it 4 stars. It just starts right off and continues at an action-packed pace. You know, we're following a lot of the same characters, but they get split up here. Some crazy stuff happens. It's a little darker in tone. We learn a lot about the history of this world. A lot of the history before the, I guess, mini apocalypse, you could call it. We learn a lot of its history and the time before that and after that. We are introduced to a lot of these new races, these new like sub-races of elves, which was really cool, and their dynamic with the other elves. It was very interesting. And we get a good deep history of all these characters, the party that we're following, you know? We kind of see how the group formed, what became of that, how they split up, why they split up. Now, some scenes of note here. We had one which was basically your horror scene, but it was incredibly gripping, incredibly terrifying. It kind of came out of left field, but it just made it that much more gripping. It was really good. Apart from the horror, we have the comedy. The comedy just works so well in this book. I don't know what it was, but compared to the other 2 books, this is just absolutely hilarious. A lot of the dynamics between Flint and Tass, you know, the dwarf and the halfling, they just make for some hilarious moments. It came off very genuine in here, just genuinely funny. You know, not like it was trying too hard. In some of the other books, I think in the 3rd book especially, it seemed kind of try hard, but in this one, it's perfect. So overall, a huge step up from the first book. The characters go through a lot more harrowing circumstances here. There's a lot of unexpected twists you really don't see coming. even for me, like this being the kind of book it is, it was impossible to tell that these twists were coming. It was really cool. So in all aspects, just a big step up. The poems in this book are really cool. I like how for a lot of the long, tedious kind of traveling scenes, we get poems to kind of sum it up, and just an interesting way of seeing what resolved or what's taking place now and how we're getting to the next area. So really cool. So that was Dragons of Winter Night, 4 stars, phenomenal. And now we get to book 3, Dragons of Spring Dawning. And I gave this one 3 stars. It was a decent wrap-up, but it was a lot slower paced than the previous books. But I'm sure this is because we got more of the villains' POVs here, the enemy POVs, so it took a while to set that up. It was pretty cool. This book did a lot of things really well here. I like that there was one character in particular who was super intriguing, and you really wanted to find out what his past was and what his story is. And the romance in this book, so it has been building up for 3 books now, and the romance takes a turn here that is very unexpected. Not your, something you can't really say you've seen a lot of, which is interesting, but I'm assuming that this is because it's kind of setting things up for the later books, because the Dragonlance universe expands a lot more. This is only the beginning, so I'm assuming it's set up for that. I could be wrong, but regardless, it was cool. The theme behind these books are really cool. It's basically talks about the balance between good and evil and why there needs to be a balance. If I'm being honest, the philosophical moments in this book kind of touched me the most. This could be due to the fact that I was going through some stuff at the time, but it's interesting. I'm going to read you one quote from this book that really touched me and could, spark a change in your life maybe. But anyways, I'll read it. "The darkness might conquer, but it could never extinguish hope. And though one candle or many might flicker and die, new candles would be lit from the old. Thus hope's flame always burns, lighting the darkness until the coming of day." So I think this perfectly sums up the theme behind this trilogy, basically how hope and faith are something that we may take for granted at times or may not care about too much, but always play a very, very important role in our lives, and that it's just important to never forget how powerful these things can be. So that's all I wanted to share. That's my review of the Dragonlance Chronicles Trilogy. Overall, excellent. I do recommend you read it, especially as a palate cleanser, or just if you want to have a fun little adventure romp and just kind of get lost in a story for a little while, an enjoyable story. And who knows, this may inspire you or may pique your interest in wanting to play D&D. I mean, it's a fun game. I've played it a few times. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to this review. Yeah, I definitely recommend the Dragonlance Trilogy. I may continue. I have a few of the other Dragonlance books, so I may be continuing that in the future. As to when, we'll see. I'll also be getting to a lot of the Forgotten Realms books. I got all the Legend of Drizzt books from my brother, who's really into that. So I will definitely be getting into that. A lot more Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms, a lot of that older kind of, D&D, plot-heavy kind of books, as well as Magic the Gathering. That's part of this too. So that being said, go ahead and like the video if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you're excited for me to get to all that stuff. And as always, thank you so much for tuning in, everybody, and I'll see you next time.